So I just wanted to, because I'm always looking at, what topics we haven't discussed before in these meetings, and what else we might be able to look at, and what's happening, what's new. And I do think this is quite an interesting subject, and this may be stuff that you've heard before. But obviously this is kind of my take on the Lord O'Shaughnessy review, having had a look at the report. What I'm planning to do is just summarise what's in the report and what his recommendations are, and then we can have a chat about what your experience is, or what your thoughts are, or how you think this might work out. So if you have heard this before, hopefully it'll be a refresher. If not, hopefully it'll be interesting to see what he's had to say. So the background to this is that there was a significant drop in commercially sponsored clinical trials in the UK between 2017 and 2022. And the figures for that are all in the report. You can see the kind of stats for that. But there was an issue. I think it was probably partly Brexit and partly other things, partly COVID as well. So the government commissioned an independent review. So they announced the review back in February, and Lord O'Shaughnessy conducted the review and then published his report. And there were a couple of government responses to the report at the same time in May of this year. So the report looks at what the issues are with commercially sponsored clinical trials in the UK, why we've seen the drop. And then there are 27 recommendations in total for what he thinks we need to do to get things back on track. And what he says is that the aim of these recommendations, or the aim of any plan, should be to double participant numbers in commercially sponsored clinical trials in the UK twice by 2027. So I think that means the numbers should be 4 times what they are now by 2027. Maths isn't my strong point, but I think that's what it means. So basically a kind of a significant increase in the number of people taking part in commercially sponsored clinical trials in the UK. So looking at the report, there are, as I said, there are 27 recommendations in total. Recommendation number 1 is to put in place SMART objectives. I kind of feel like SMART's been around quite a long time, and maybe it's a little bit old hat now. I don't know, maybe that's just me. But anyway, SMART objectives for commercial clinical research in the UK. And he's really talking to the likes of the NIHR, the HRA, the NHS, in terms of the recommendations that he's saying. He's not really aiming this so much at the industry. It's more around the infrastructure for research in the UK. So that's recommendation number 1 as a general, is to have SMART objectives in place for clinical trials in the UK. And then the rest of the recommendations are based on problem statements. So he says what the problem is, and then he puts some recommendations underneath that for how we should move forward. So the first problem is the approvals and setup of clinical trials in the UK. So regulatory and ethics committee approvals. So his first couple of recommendations after the first one, recommendations 2 to 4, are to speed up the approval process, and also to standardise costings for clinical trials. Now, I kind of think there's been quite a lot of work done on this. We've got combined review now. We've got MHRA are trying to get approvals through faster. We've had the HRA approval to try and deal with the R&D issues. And also we've got the standard costing templates as well. So, but I guess what he's saying is there's more work that needs to be done on those 2 areas. So that's approvals and setup. The next one is about lack of transparency. So recommendation number 5 is to have monthly figures submitted from the regulatory authority and from sponsors. So sponsors would be required to provide monthly figures to somebody about how many people they've got in clinical trials in the UK. And then recommendation 6 is to have a national public database. So I guess that would be the equivalent of CTIS for the UK. So to have a national public database where clinical trials can be posted. So So at the moment, and the HRA are using the ISRCTN to publicly post clinical trials. But I think what he's saying is we need our own national database for public information about clinical trials. The next problem is lack of accountability. So recommendation 7 is to have targets and benchmarking for clinical trials. And again, I think the idea is this would work through the NIHR, and the benchmarking and targets would be set by them. And recommendation 8 is to have key performance indicators, which we've already mentioned this afternoon, for everyone involved. Again, I guess that would run through the NIHR. I don't know. Or the MHRA maybe. And then recommendation 9 is to improve the clinical research networks. So there's more it's really around infrastructure, I'd have said, rather than accountability. But I guess it means that the benchmarking can work certainly for the investigational sites, can work through the CRN. Which is kind of the way I think it's supposed to work now, but I don't know that it always works that well. The next problem is lack of prioritization in the NHS. So lack of prioritization for commercially sponsored clinical research. So his recommendation number 10 is to have a statement from NHS leadership emphasizing the importance of commercially sponsored clinical trials within the NHS and within the UK. And then recommendation 11 is to have targets for NIHR, I guess, again, to kind of prioritise commercially sponsored research in their portfolio and in their provision of resources as well. The next problem is that NHS staff are not incentivised to implement commercially sponsored clinical research. So recommendation 12 is to funnel income directly to departments rather than going into the R&D fund, that the income would go directly to the departments that are running the trials. And then recommendation 13 is to have a career development path within commercial clinical trial setting for NHS staff. I was doing a course recently, and somebody said that they were a physician and they were interested in getting involved in clinical research, but they'd had no kind of training around clinical research in their education at all. So the medical training in the UK doesn't really provide any development in clinical research. I think there are some postgrad options out there, but not during medical training. So I think to highlight the career options in research for trainee medics, but also, you know, once people are qualified, to provide additional career development for like research nurses and clinical trial pharmacists and all those kind of people. Again, I know there's a couple of people working in the NHS, so I don't know, maybe you can comment later what your perception of that is currently. And then the next one is a low profile of research with patients. So patients are not really aware of commercially sponsored clinical trials, and they're not necessarily given the option to take part, or they don't really understand it. So recommendations 14 to 17 are to increase the public profile of commercially sponsored research. I kind of think that happened quite a bit during COVID, because people became aware of clinical trials for the COVID vaccines a lot more than they were before, I think. But I think there is more work to be done. I know, again, I think it's there's the it's okay to ask or something. There was a campaign to encourage people to ask about clinical trials and that kind of thing. So I think there's been some work done, but we've probably got more to do. Promoting conversations with patients, and again, that would have to come down to the doctors and nurses and people that are interacting with patients, as to, you know, just, you know, remembering to talk to patients about the option of clinical research. And he's also proposing to have a research delivery network coordinating centre. to expand access and diversity in clinical trials. And again, diversity is a hot topic in clinical research as well, isn't it? So that's his one of his ideas is to create this research delivery network, which would kind of work with patients and increase the profile of research and make research more accessible as well. Then this one I think could be quite controversial. It has been in the past, but a failure to leverage NHS data resource. So I think that's probably looking at, identifying patients and also maybe looking at real world data as well. Recommendations 18 to 21 are about how to increase communication with regard to the NHS data resource that we've got, but also, and I think this is going to be critical, addressing consent for use of patient data. And I don't know how many of you remember, but it was probably about 10 years ago, there was this thing about how data were going to be NHS data were going to be available for the pharma industry and all the rest of it. And they were about to make it go live. And then suddenly there was like a big campaign about, well, we haven't given consent for this and how can you use our data, blah, blah, blah. And the whole thing was put on hold. So I think the consent issue and the transparency issue are going to be really important if they want to make any changes on how we use NHS data. But obviously there is a lot of very useful data within the system. And then the last sort of problem area is lack of primary care involvement in research. So secondary care, a lot of research tends to be done in secondary care rather than primary care. So recommendations 22 to 25 were around incentives for GPs to take part in clinical trials, and also increasing use of decentralized clinical trials where the GPs might be involved in doing local assessments or local visits with patients, and also artificial intelligence as well. That's around increasing involvement of primary care. And then the final two recommendations are clinical trial acceleration networks to be established. So I think these would be kind of similar to the CRNs, but kind of focused on increasing access to clinical trials, I guess. And then recommendation 27 is to have an implementation plan in place by autumn 2023. So it's looking fairly autumnal out there at the moment. So I'm kind of thinking it should be appearing sometime soon. I don't know if anybody knows any more about that and, who's writing this implementation plan and where it's coming from and when it might appear. But we should be seeing something hopefully fairly soon.